Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good Wednesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 22nd of October. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your very latest weather information. You can do that a number of ways, one of which is the NOAA Weather Radio. Weather.gov/Alaska is a great way to do that. It's the same place that you'll get to if you head to arh.noaa.gov. Give us a call on the weather info line at 800-472-0391. Find information during the day on Twitter, on Facebook under NWS Alaska, or in the afternoon, get your daily afternoon map briefing on YouTube from NWS Anchorage or NWS Fairbanks. And then after this show, via our broadcast partner here at Alaska Public, you'll be able to go to alaskapublic.org and watch this complete broadcast of Alaska weather and watch your favorite spots over and over and over again if you like. Here's what's coming our way. With the storm moving across the Bering, we're watching for high surf conditions to develop along the western Alaska coast. That could begin as early as about midday Thursday, so watch for high surf conditions then. That's going to start around the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline and around St. Lawrence Island. We think that'll be possible in Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound probably a little bit closer to 6 p.m. on Thursday, and that will continue to build in a little bit further out toward Buckland and into the eastern sections of Kotzebue Sound by Thursday night and into early Friday morning. The worst of it seems to be around Norton Sound. About 2 to 3 foot storm surge is expected in Norton Sound. Elsewhere, we're talking about 1 to 2 feet of storm surge, and most places will be dealing with about 6 to 8 foot breaking waves around the shore. So again, the worst of it's probably going to be right here around Norton Sound. But this is all due to the storm front that's working across the Bering Sea at this point with a little bit more of a south and southwesterly push. And again, this could begin as early as about midday tomorrow. So if you're in those places that have a little bit more trouble with that south and southwesterly wind developing, tomorrow about midday is going to be when that starts to begin around your village there. Let's take a look at the satellite pictures, and you can see that frontal boundary working across the west. Get a decent batch of moisture out ahead of it there. It's not a whole lot of precipitation expected with this. It will be weakening as it moves from west-east, especially as it hits the western coast, but a decent amount of dry air out ahead of that as well. So that northerly wind that's been predominant for the last several days now across the western coastline will gradually come to an end as warmer air moves in from south and southwest. Then the winds pick up during the midday tomorrow, and then you'll get back into more of a west and northwesterly flow as that low pressure system works its way north and northeast. Looking across the rest of Alaska, you can see the low pressure system across the Gulf of Alaska has really become a lot more ragged as it's been spinning in on itself and wrapping in more of the same air instead of having such a stronger weather pattern associated with it. And you can see some of the moisture working northward in through the southern Yukon across the Wrangell-St. Elias region, and that's been promoting a lot of drier air across the Matanuska and Susitna valleys in the last couple of days. The Kenai Peninsula is cleared out nicely, and you can see some of the drier air moving over Norton Sound, Bethel, Dillingham, and King Salmon. Even Kodiak Island's been looking fairly clear. Up across the north, though, that's been meaning more of an easterly wind, and that's kept a lot of snow and sometimes poor visibility around places like Barrow. Once again, snow's been falling there. Fort Yukon has seen some improving weather over what we were looking at yesterday when visibility seemed to crash toward the back half of the afternoon. And once again, you can see the very widespread band of clouds working across the western Bering associated with that next weather change. Here it is on the map. The low pressure system just south and west of the Gulf of Anadyr is at 988 millibars. On the south side of that is around 1,031 millibars around the high. That's promoting that northerly flow, and once again, as you see those bands of black tighten up a little bit, those are lines of constant pressure. The tighter they get, the faster the wind's moving, and in this case, that's promoting that northerly flow across the Alaska Peninsula, where we've seen some stronger gusts once again today on the order of 35 to 45 miles per hour. Probably nothing too unusual if you live in some of those windy spots. And low pressure out over the central Gulf is dragging in that drier air across the north and western Gulf and Prince William Sound. A lot of what you're seeing here on this satellite picture is actually the snow-capped peaks of the Chugach Range And then when you get further north, more of that is a little bit of cloud cover associated with snow there across Barrow, out toward AKwx, Prudhoe Bay, and Dead Horse. Rain was falling again across southeastern Alaska. Another area of low pressure just south and west of Haida Gwaii at 989 millibars will continue to work around each other here for the next several days. Going into tonight, the frontal boundary working across the Bering is moving fairly quickly at this point. It should reach St. Lawrence Island with a little bit more of a south and southwesterly flow during the early morning hours tomorrow, bringing a better chance for light snow through the region, and some of the winds will be a little bit stronger there from the Bering Strait and points northward into the Chukchi Sea. Winds across the interior should let up fairly quickly, and where winds are calm, you might see a little bit more ice develop in the overnight hours, but with a south and southwesterly wind adding some warmer air into the region, it probably won't last through the day tomorrow. Look around Prince William Sound and northwestern sections of the Gulf. Showers could develop there tonight and briefly pass through. There's a better chance for some snow showers across some of the higher terrain. There's a frontal boundary lingers very close to the Wrangell-St. Elias region. Light rainfall is possible across southeastern Alaska and will keep the northerlies going across the Alaska Peninsula. The winds should gradually subside as high pressure moves into the region. Bristol Bay will start to see more clouds during Thursday morning, and just north of that expect a chance for some light snow as we go into Thursday afternoon. Behind that, some of that may mix in with a brief band of freezing drizzle, and then some colder westerly winds will set back in. A frontal boundary from Adak and Atka and westward will drape slowly into the North Pacific. It's sitting on the northern side of high pressure. That is slowly working its way eastward, and that'll keep the strongest weather out across the west coast. And once again, high surf advisories begin as far south as the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, around Hooper Bay and points northward as early as about noon tomorrow. As we get into Friday, the frontal boundary is now into the western sections of the lower Yukon and even the middle Yukon Valley, up around Kotzebue and into the Chukchi Sea coast. By this point, the frontal boundary itself is weakening, but we still have an onshore push of that wind. And so if you're in one of those south and westerly wind-prone areas like Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound and the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island, you may still need to watch for high surf conditions there. Low pressure north of the Gulf of Anadyr at 991 millibars is starting to fill in as that storm weakens a little bit, but we'll keep that west and southwesterly flow going into Saturday. Low pressure across the north and western Gulf is also weakening and filling in, but it's still keeping that south and southeasterly flow across parts of southeastern Alaska. So Juneau, Craig, Klawock, even Hyder still looking at some light rainfall. A little bit further north, maybe into the Lynn Canal around Haines and Skagway, there's a chance for some snow showers. A lot of that, though, will be a little bit higher up in elevation. Around Prince William Sound, as this wave of low pressure is working its way eastward, and even the Cook Inlet region, we may see an opportunity for some light snow or kind of a rain and snow mix. Some mixed precipitation should be expected a little bit closer to Cook Inlet and certainly further south of Kenai toward Homer and even into the Shelikof Strait region. That's a look at your weather as we get into the end of the week. Let's take a look at current temperatures now around southeast. Some of the warmer spots today are around Petersburg in the upper 40s and lower 50s. Hyder made it to 48 degrees, but you can see most of southeastern Alaska was hovering just below that 50-degree mark today. Around Prince William Sound from Valdez to Cordova and even into Seward, temps were generally in the mid to upper 40s. Cordova, one of the warmer spots. Out around Middleton Island, still hovering around 50 degrees, about the same as what we saw around Kodiak. 42 in Kenai, 39 in Anchorage. Talkeetna and Skwetna were holding in the mid to upper 30s today. Healy was a cooler 24, 26 around Fort Greely, and 31 in Fairbanks with Northway and Eagle in the upper 20s. Fort Yukon was 25. Around the Arctic coast, we saw temperatures in the teens and 20s with Kaktovik and Prudhoe Bay, Dead Horse, pretty close to about 25 degrees there. Barrow at 16. 20s for the Kotzebue Sound region and Point Hope and Point Lay with Wainwright at 19. It looks like Kivalina was showing 29, 30 in Shishmaref, 33 in Nome today with Norton Sound temperatures at or just below the freezing point there. You can see Unalakleet at 32. Grayling was 30 degrees. Around McGrath it was 32. Bethel right on that 30-degree mark. And southwestern Alaska and Bristol Bay temps were just shy of 40 degrees by the 4 o'clock hour. And the Alaska Peninsula was hovering pretty close to 40 degrees on the Bering and the Pacific coast. 43 in Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. The Pribilofs are also fairly close to 40 degrees, considerably cooler than just a few weeks ago when the temperatures just wouldn't seem to budge out of the 50s. Adak and Atka were in the mid-40s and 47 way out at Attu. As we look at overnight lows, most areas will drop into the single digits and teens for the interior. With light winds and even a clear sky, it promises to be a pretty cold night there with teens and 20s for the Arctic coast. The Seward Peninsula is in the 20s tonight, lower 20s for the YK Delta. The Alaska Peninsula is in the 30s and 40s, mid-40s for the central Aleutians, with southeast in the mid-30s, especially for the inner waterways. Coastal areas will be a little bit milder, probably low 40s for you. Prince William Sound in the lower 30s with The Matanuska, Susitna Valleys, and the Anchorage Bowl likely in the mid-20s, with highs there tomorrow just a hair above freezing. Let's say mid to upper 30s for many. The southern tip of the Kenai and Kodiak Island will be in the lower 40s. The Alaska Peninsula in the mid to upper 40s, closer to 50 around Dutch Harbor. 45 for St. Paul, 43 in Nunivak Island, and lower 30s once you get into the Kuskokwim and Yukon interior there in the middle and upper parts of the valley. Once you get a little bit further in toward the interior, teens and 20s for most. 20s for the Arctic coast, the Seward Peninsula up to 35 around Nome tomorrow. Flying weather now shows IFR conditions generally east of Point Barrow all the way out toward Kaktovik, and a large part of the coastal plain will also be dealing with MVFR conditions there, but you can see some breaks generally south and west of Wainwright to Point Hope, and VFR is expected across most of the mainland by tomorrow afternoon. There will be some patches of MVFR conditions there expected around Antasta Pass, and some hit and miss MVFR across central and northern sections of southeast and out toward Hyder and into British Columbia. Across the west coast with the approaching frontal boundary, expect visibility to drop fairly quickly once that gets closer to your village. Watch for IFR conditions around a good chunk of the Seward Peninsula and the northern half of the Yukon Delta there, especially north of Hooper Bay, and probably at times around the Kuskokwim Valley near Bethel by the afternoon. Otherwise, MVFR for most of the Bering Sea. Let's check your pass conditions, though. Anaktuvuk Pass should see some improvements as the day goes on. Starting out at MVFR, we expect similar conditions in Adigan Pass, trending toward visual flight rule as your Thursday goes. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass should be okay for Thursday, but watch for some changing weather. If you've got some plans heading into Friday, that's going to look a lot different. Rainy Pass, visual flight rule is expected through most of Thursday. Windy Pass should be okay. Again, the front is still well to the west at this point. Isabel Pass for Thursday, we're calling VFR. And for Mentasta Pass, again, we're going to start out at IFR, so worse conditions in the morning. And as you saw, just a very thin strip of marginal restrictions there along the mountain. So watch for some changing but improving weather there. And Tanita Pass should also see some improvements during your Thursday. Portage Pass, we expect to turn over to VFR by the afternoon as dry weather lasts. And Chilkoot and White Pass should see holding pretty close to VFR, but don't be surprised with some passing snow showers to briefly dip into MVFR during the day. Now, freezing levels show that cold air is retreating somewhat across the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline, and in the upper atmosphere, of course, when another storm moves in, we get a lot of warm air building up ahead of that, and that's exactly what we're seeing here, with St. Lawrence Island seeing freezing levels aloft closer to 2,000 feet and as high as 6,000 feet over Adak and Atka. There's still some warmer air out of the Gulf of Alaska, but the bulk of Alaska, especially the interior, is below freezing at the surface and aloft at this point. Icing potential follows that frontal boundary fairly close in this case. A light to isolated moderates expected across parts of the YK Delta and into the Brooks Range, and generally north across the coastal plain and the Arctic coast below 8,000 feet there. But you'll have to climb pretty high up above the Seward Peninsula and the YK, generally above 6,000 feet and even higher if you're going south and west of Adak or Akka. That's above 8,000 feet. Most other areas should not see a significant potential for icing as we go through your Thursday. The jet stream now shows a large pronounced trough that's still digging its way through the Gulf of Alaska and even into the eastern Pacific. Most of that is sending a south and westerly jet stream right over the Pacific Northwest of the lower 48, and that combines again across northern parts of Canada with wind speeds there around 50 to 80 knots. The storm maker for us is a predominant west and southwesterly flow coming out of eastern Asia that's working its way into the Bering Sea, and that's driving that surface storm that we see crossing the Bering as we go through tomorrow. Wind speeds aloft around 30,000 feet over the Bering, ranging around 90 to about 120 knots. At 9,000 feet, you can see that broad westerly flow crossing the Bering. That's one reason that storm is going to zip along fairly quickly as we go through the daytime tomorrow. Across south and western sections of the interior, you can see wind speeds between 25, maybe as high as 30 knots as you get across the Arctic coast as those become a little more southerly. Winds are still westerly coming across the Aleutians. They pick up speed a little bit across the Alaska Peninsula, and that may still drive some gap winds as we go through the daytime tomorrow. Low pressure is relatively weak across the eastern Gulf. Wind speeds are wrapping into coastal sections of southeast around 15 to 20 knots, and we see relatively light wind speeds across south central Alaska from the south and southwest. At 3,000 feet, winds are a little bit stronger coming in from the north and west across the central Gulf. And again, that could make some breezy conditions briefly in the morning around Prince William Sound, but don't expect a whole lot of wind during the day. Westerlies coming across the YK around 20 to 35 knots, and you'll see westerlies crossing through the Bering Strait also around 20 to 30 knots there. Once the winds get inland, they really slow down wind speeds around 10 knots or so. Coming in from the south and across the Arctic coast. They pick up a little bit more once you get offshore, generally from the east to west around 25 knots with much stronger winds at 3,000 feet across the Chukchi Sea. The winds are pretty light across the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, only around 15 to 20 knots or so. So what about turbulence? Well, with the front coming in across the Bering and reaching the coast, we should be planning for at least some light to isolated moderate and probably some occasional moderate around Bethel, northward to the Norton Sound region. Some of this could extend out on the coast during the morning hours as that front's coming in. But watch for changing winds and changing wind speeds. The worst of this will probably be below 6,000 feet. We expect at least a little bit of chop, maybe some isolated moderate across the Chukchi Sea coast and maybe a little bit east of Barrow. And then along the back side of this, another trough of low pressure coming in behind that main surface storm, probably stir up the wind if you're flying north of St. Lawrence Island or across the Bering Strait, through the Alaska Peninsula region or through the central west areas of the Aleutians out toward Kiska. This will probably expand a little bit more during the day and into tomorrow, so if you do have some flight plans, keep your eyes on the turbulence, certainly the icing potential, but also on the visibility through any of the passes across the western Alaska Range region and into your favorite landing spots there across the YK Delta, Norton Sound, and Kotzebue Sound heading into Thursday night and Friday. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with sea surface temperatures and an update on the ice edge and marine weather here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Atmospheric researchers have confirmed that the Arctic haze, a polluted air mass that forms each winter over the Arctic region, is widespread and deep, increasing scientific interest about its effect upon the climate. In 1983, scientists aboard a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration research aircraft took airborne samples of the haze. From the atmosphere above the Brooks Range in northern Alaska. And over Barrow, Alaska. Flying through the haze at altitudes from 50 to 28,000 feet, the researchers analyzed the chemical structure of samples collected by instruments on the plane. A preliminary air sample analysis by Dr. R.A. Rasmussen of Oregon Graduate Center indicates the haze largely is composed of a chemical compound, PCE, and hydrocarbons from fossil fuel combustion. This tends to substantiate the theory that the haze is caused by atmospheric pollutants being carried into the Arctic from principally Europe and northern Asia.
12. CN dropping off. We just passed through an incredibly thick layer, went off scale on the ethylometer. It also is dropping off now on the NEF. Now we're coming back into, look at it, we're coming into another layer. And you'll be picking it up in a minute.
I'll pick it up in 1 minute.
Yeah. So we're coming, the CN is coming in. It's just as good as the other one. Look at it. The NEF is starting to pick it up.
Well, this is our trace here. This was the previous layer.
Fantastic. Oh, no, just a thin one. It's falling off again. See?
I went completely off scale.
Good. Gee, that's fantastic. No, this is just a little patch. See it fall off again?
Okay, now.
Went through a clean area, now we're coming back into another patch. You'll be picking it up shortly. Well, the NEF is coming up again, too. Okay, it's really patchy.
There we are.
There, see? Oh, look at it. Look at it climb.
Yeah.
Hey, fantastic.
We had a rather diffuse layer with not very strong concentration. Here we saw a rather stronger layer. I was then able to reduce the resolution time of the instrument. And then here we saw an incredibly thick layer, back down to nothing down there. Oh, gee. Hey, hold it. That's 8, 10, 11. 11 counts. Here we are now in another very strong layer here, and I hope if my instrument goes off scale again,
Hey, the NEF is climbing higher than it's ever been now.
backed off scale again.
Yeah, I know. Pretty low already. We're at 100 meters. We're going to go lower.
Time 23:47. We're holding in the haze now at 952 meters. We passed through descending at about 3 minutes ago, and now we're back up into it and holding steady right in the center of the haze.
This filter is so-called millipore filter. All of the air was restricted to go through the center by means of the plastic mask. You can see the black spot in the center is the deposit of particles. We can analyze these by a variety of chemical and physical means to study the carbon, both the black carbon and also any organic type of carbon.
Heading the score of scientists on the NOAA study is Dr. Russell Schnell.
Okay, we found the haze layers to be more numerous than anticipated, and the intensity of the pollution exceedingly larger than anyone had expected. And finally, the pollution was spread over much larger areas than we had originally thought.
Flight data will be used in developing improved climate models for determining the effect of the haze on the Arctic climate.
Time now for a look at marine weather, and we're going to start off with sea surface temperatures there for this afternoon. You can see the really cold weather up across the Arctic coast, of course, but with that northerly flow bringing down that colder ocean water, it's no wonder the Pribilofs have been cooling off. You can correlate that to temperatures that are about 4 to 5 degrees Celsius at this point. However, with the southwesterly fetch building, that may push some of that warmer weather northward once again and also bring in some stronger winds to the west coast. Again, high surf advisory is posted for areas north of Hooper Bay as we get into noontime tomorrow. Here's a look at the sea ice edge. With that easterly flow, it's also pushing the larger ice pack further and further south and also helping to freeze up areas east of Point Barrow. As winds lighten in certain areas around the western coast, watch for a rapid expansion of that ice, of course, since the water is cold enough to support that. With that southwesterly flow, though, that may change some of the ice conditions there in Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound. So watch for updates. You can find those anytime by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. Now for the weather in southeast, a northerly flow will be predominant across the North and South Lynn Canal into the Stevens Passage area with winds around 20 knots or so. 4 to 5 foot seas are expected in the northern half of the inner waterways, but look for more of a southeasterly flow across Clarence Strait with 5 to 7 foot seas, the highest out toward the Dixon entrance, of course. South and southeasterly south of Sitka with 7 to 10 foot seas there on a 15 to 20 knot wind, and more of a northerly flow coming out of Yakutat with an 8 foot sea expected on 15 knot winds. By Friday, more of a southerly flow is working up the coastline. 15 knots in most areas there with a 5 to about 7 foot seas in the highest areas, and winds diminish across the Lynn Canal down to 10 knots with a 2 foot sea. We're still holding on to southerlies across the Clarence Strait, and the winds around Petersburg and points north have gone southerly around 20 knots there with a 4 foot sea on Friday. For south central, winds will be pretty light across Prince William Sound and the northern parts of the Cook Inlet, but once you get out toward the Barren Islands, a stronger northwesterly flow is squeezing through the gap. Look for 30 knot winds there with 8 foot seas and northerlies east of Kodiak around 25 knots with a 10 foot sea. As we get into Friday, the northwesterlies are still cutting through the Barrens at 25 to 30 knots. Winds are still variable across the northern parts of Cook Inlet. The winds have picked up, though, a little bit south of Kenai. We still have light northerly winds inside of Prince William Sound and southwesterly flow outside of Middleton Island with a 15 knot wind at 5 foot seas there. And northwesterlies continue to move across Kodiak Island between 20 and 25 knots. Look for 5 foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait. Across the Alaska Peninsula on Thursday, north and northwesterly winds will continue across Bristol Bay with a 20 knot flow there at 6 foot seas. Some higher gusts should be expected south and west of Kodiak Island all the way out toward Falls Pass. Some of those could reach upwards of 45 to 55 knots at their worst, so be prepared for some quick bursts there, but most likely we'll be dealing with sustained winds around 30 to 35 knots and seas around 9 to 12 feet. On Friday, the winds start to slow down a little bit on the Bering Sea coast around the Cold Bay. Look for 10 knot winds with an 8 foot sea. Northwesterlies inside Bristol Bay and 20 to 25 knots on the Pacific side. Still watching for some areas with higher gusts there with 5 to 7 foot seas. For the Aleutians, a broad southwesterly flow through the central and eastern part of the chain, maybe as far west as Kiska with a 25-knot wind and 11-foot seas. Looking at more westerly flow out towards Shemya. Southwesterlies north of Unalaska and winds on the Pacific coast 25 to 35 knots with 6 to 7-foot seas there, diminishing to 6 to 7-foot seas across areas south of Adak and Atka. And you can see more of a variable flow there. 10-knot winds on either side of Adak and Atka, and also on Alaska. You'll see some more variable flow there as we get into Friday afternoon. More of a westerly push into Kiska by the afternoon, 15 knots with a 7-foot sea. Now for the west, of course, with a west and southwesterly flow, we'll watch for high surf conditions there, generally north of Hooper Bay, beginning around noontime tomorrow. Southerly flow around St. Lawrence Island with a 12-foot sea expected with a 35-knot wind. Southwesterlies around the Pribilofs with a 10-foot sea. And look for southwesterlies to develop south of Mokoriak with a 5-foot sea there on 25-knot winds. By Friday, we keep that south and westerly fetch moving through. 25 to 30-knot winds are expected. Most areas around 9 to 13 feet if you're north of Hooper Bay. We're still looking at south and southwesterly winds moving into Norton Sound, and a westerly flow coming into the Kuskokwim Bay area with a 7-foot sea. Southwesterlies continue for the Pribilofs as well. And for the Arctic coast, easterlies are moving through. That's keeping that water cold and keeping the snow and poor visibility going across the Arctic coast. 7 to as high as 9-foot seas all the way out toward Barrow. Southwesterlies moving air offshore from Cape Lisburn down through Kotzebue Sound initially on Thursday, but the wind should start to go a little more southerly around the Chukchi Seacoast Friday afternoon. 20 to 25 knots, watching for freezing spray in some areas there. 5 to as high as 8-foot seas are expected. And once you get into the Beaufort Seacoast, 5 to 8-foot seas, when more of an east and southeasterly flow should be expected by Friday. Now a quick recap of what's going on with our weather patterns out in the Bering. Strong weather systems moving across the Bering Sea. It should reach the west coast as we get into tomorrow afternoon. Rainfall continues across southeast with patches of precipitation across south central, but clearing out for most in the interior. As the storm system moves into the west, watch for high surf conditions to develop north of Hooper Bay through the day on Thursday. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
It's never too early to set expectations and goals for your child's education. The UA College Savings Plan provides opportunities that can help you reach your educational savings goals. Save in Alaska. Study anywhere. There is more information available by calling 1-888, the number 4, and then Alaska. This message sponsored by the UA College Savings Plan.